Hi folks, you're with Tacitus Today. Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of toxic bosses and or the term that's used, toxic bosses. You could read incompetent or lazy or stupid or whatever, but toxic is a generic term. Now, there's a lot of something came into my feed as I was looking on doing on social media here, and this thing came into toxic boss. So I had a look at it and found that probably a bit to my surprise, really, that there was a plethora of complaints about toxic bosses, and it was nearly all women, not all, but nearly all women complaining about nearly all women bosses. So there weren't many men that were complaining. There were some, but weren't many men who were complaining. And there were some women who were focusing on, they were lesbians and the boss was a straight white male and he was Hitler. There's always that sort of stuff, but typically it's white women complaining about their white women bosses. Now, there's some complaints about incompetent minorities, as in black lesbians being appointed, that type of thing. But generally, it's the white women boss is particularly being singled out for being, again, using the generic term toxic. So I just want to talk a bit about how the landscape has changed in terms of the affirmative action programs, diversity, equity, inclusion, and so on. Now, one of the sort of key aspirations, if you like, of the feminists and the race grifter, gender grifter, hustler type brigade is that to achieve equal outcomes. So, and they particularly focus on in the workplace, this is jobs that are well-paying jobs, prestigious jobs, that sort of thing. So they want that. They're not interested in the jobs cleaning the sewer pipes. They don't care about those, that they're 95% male, or that it's 99% men who are in the front line of wars, getting shot at and killed. Don't care about that. It's the prestigious jobs in the nice air-conditioned offices with the good sound. Those are the ones that they want equal outcomes. If it's catching rats in the sewer, no, we don't want equal outcomes. Men can do that job. So it's already very disingenuous from the outset in terms of their goals of pursuing, supposed equity. But just looking at, the sort of people that are getting shoehorned into managerial jobs. Now, just to sort of around the early 90s, as a much younger guy, I noticed that especially in American companies, that affirmative action was already making a show, and that minorities, women and or lesbians or whatever, gay guys were being put into managerial positions simply for the cosmetics of producing equity and equal outcomes. And because the desperation to do it was so sort of immediate and sudden and feverish, they were grabbing people from anywhere really and putting them into these positions. Now, let's say, for example, there was a bank, an international finance company that my company I was with at the time were doing business with, and they were just grabbing receptionists, the lowest level admin people, women, and giving them managerial sounding jobs. Deputy general manager in charge of communications, assistant vice president in charge of whatever, and the director of customer experience, all these sorts of titles. And it was ridiculous because you knew you were talking to a receptionist. One time I had a meeting with, actually this was a job interview. I got tapped for a job, and I'd been meeting somebody called Smith who was coming from America, and this was for like a Asia Pacific director, and it was quite a senior, well-paying job. And they didn't have an office in Australia at the time. They wanted the head office to be located in Sydney. I'd been tapped for it, and So I was to meet the international vice president of the company, somebody called Smith, and so I was, went along and appeared, and they hadn't given me the name, just Smith International Vice. I just assumed it would be a guy, but I had no particular preconceived notion. Out came this young woman in her sort of 26, 27 years old, wearing, I thought, an unprofessionally short dress, but anyway, so. And she comes out, shakes my hand, so how Billy Bob come in, and they've just rented these serviced offices for the day or whatever it was, and sit down. And so she talks like a receptionist. She's got this very unsophisticated manner about her and quite common, if not vulgar. She's not showing any particular intelligence or there's nothing there. Anyway, she's the international vice president. So, and she tells me the story of how she came to be there, which she's very proud of. Tells me that she had some bullshit job somewhere, sweeping a floor, and some guy came past who worked at the bank or the finance company that was financing this particular firm, and he was talking to her a minute or two, and he says, "This is in Los Angeles." Okay, he says, "I'm going to make you a star, and call me tomorrow." And she gets given this job that she was outrageously unqualified for, of international vice president, and her salary sort of jumps from $30,000 a year to $1 million a year. She sees it that she's like a movie star that just got discovered by the Hollywood director or something. She's got that type of perspective on it. So I'm talking to this receptionist from someone who would work on the checkout at some outer suburban grocery store. That she's got that sort of manner and vibe about her. But here she is on $1 million a year salary. So that's an example of the sort of things that were going on. I mean, that's a more extreme example, but that's the example of the sort of things were going on. There's many organizations, particularly big finance, high tech, that sort of stuff, that saw they were, or perceived at the time, they were obligated to pursue this equity, equal outcome stuff. And it happened very quickly. There are organizations that were, say, I don't know, the technical sales department was all men. And a couple of years later, there was no men left in it. The only man there was gay, that type of thing. So it began, once it started in those areas, finance and high tech. Now, they were creating these jobs. They weren't real jobs. And, I mean, way back when, I dated a lady that briefly who was in one of these finance companies, and she was like she was just a typist, for fuck's sake, and they gave her some general manager or some fancy sounding job, and she was she wasn't a genius. How can I put it? But as I think I mentioned in the other video, I was looking in the financial pages, and she's now in America, and she's made president of the bank. Here's this typist who was affirmative action into some bullshit job is now the president of the bank. I could have married her and then just been a himbo, sort of staying in the waterfront mansion, swimming in the pool, and living a luxury lifestyle, because her income's like $20 million a year or something now, and she's she's just a fucking typist. But once so these people were being put into managerial roles. Now, the way it worked, certainly when I first entered the workforce, was that, with some exception, again, you always had the chairman of the board's, wastrel nephew being given some, but there were very few of those people. There were hardly any of them around. So the overall effect they had on the economy wasn't as great as some mass movement of affirmative action, which is, of course, what we saw in the following years. Now, it didn't mean that every boss was perfect, or every, prior to affirmative action and DEI, it didn't mean that every boss was perfect or every boss was a top class manager. There were still people with many insecurities. There were still people that were being promoted because they were compliant flunkies, and those things still happened. but they weren't as numerous as they are today, and that's the difference. Now, I remember the just in terms of boss shortcomings, when the first job I had was as a 14-year-old, was a flunky and a shit kicker in a warehouse. There used to be a lot of regional warehouses back in the day, and this particular warehouse, they did things like soda and cordials and mixer drinks, that type of stuff. And they had this like regional warehouse, and I got a job there over the school summer holidays, and on some ridiculous 50 cents an hour or something like that, which I thought was decent money back at the time when you're 14. And I didn't think much of the boss. He was a guy probably, he seemed ancient to me then, but he was probably a guy in his mid-40s. And he was the manager of an outer suburban warehouse, and hardly an important job. And he came across as rather coarse and vulgar, and I didn't think much of. I think he'd been in the army. Didn't really think a whole lot of him. But he was the boss, and hey, I was just there to do a job, and I didn't care. Now, after I'd been there for a few, like I was now, I don't know, 16 or 17, still at the high school at this point, and he then gave the deputy supervisor or something like that had quit or whatever, wasn't there anymore, and so he said over the holidays, instead of working as a casual on odd hours, he said, "Do you want to take over the role of the supervisor?" And so I was a little surprised. He said, "Well, you're experienced, you've done work here, and by the way, you can read and write. Those guys can't." So the quality of manager that he was managing a bunch of people who were, illiterate and probably slightly mentally retarded, I would think. And at worst case, they'd have left school when they were like 13 years old, and so they maybe only had 1 or 2 years. But back in those days, they would force you to repeat each year if you didn't at least perform reasonably well in the end of year exam. So it wasn't unusual then to find people who were 14 years old who were still in first year high school because they kept on repeating, because they kept on failing. I'm sure some of them had dyslexia or whatever. But so anyway, he gave me that job. Now, in terms of a toxic boss, this was my first direct exposure to what today it would be called toxic. I just thought the guy was a dickhead at the time, but it was. The things he would do would be, he would make promises. If you do this, I'll do that, and he wouldn't honour them. He would just arbitrarily, randomly honour them, then deny he'd ever made such a promise. So. So he would prime you up, and he'd come to you and say, "Look, I know you want to go to that football match, later on today. Look, I want to help you out a bit here. So if you can get this and this done, and get that done, and finish this off, then you can leave early and go and watch the football match." "Oh, gee, thanks, boss. Oh, wow, okay, yeah, all right then." So I'd get done what he wanted to get done and bust my ass. And so, all right, then, well, where are you going, Billy Bob? "Well, you said that if I got this and this done, that I could go." "I never said that. Now, look, you're not going anywhere. I want you to do this, this, and this, and that, and that. But you said, no, I didn't. Look, Billy Bob, if it's going to come down to it, do you want to look for another job? Is that how you want?" So, "Oh, shit, okay." It's going to be like that. So he would do that. Other things he would do would be, I would tell the employees that were reporting to me, "Okay, go and do this and go and do that," which is instructions he maybe had even given me. And then I'd go out to lunch or go around the corner to get a sandwich, and he'd come straight out. I mean, my ass wasn't even out the door. He'd come straight out, and he'd tell those employees to do other things. So, "No, go and do this, go and do that, go and do so and so." And so I'd come back from lunch, and he'd say, "Billy Bob, I want to see you." "Sure, boss. What is it?" "Well, why hasn't this and this been done?" I said, "Well, I told Jimmy Jack and Jimmy John to do those things, so I don't know. I don't know why they didn't do it. That was the last sort of directions I gave them before I went off to lunch. Well, I don't care. It hasn't been done, and that's what I'm concerned about. Are you up to this job or not? I'm not happy, Billy Bob. I mean, and then I'd go to these guys, and they'd say, no, he came and told us to do this and that. I'd go back to him and say, well, why did you tell them to do something different, and then blame me for not getting the job done? He would then just deny it. So this is an example of a toxic boss. But I found that sort of pattern of toxicity, again, using toxicity, that toxicity didn't really change that much. When you come across toxic bosses, they tend to operate within a range of probabilities. And even as I got older and was myself, a VP and an EVP, all that sort of stuff, I found that range didn't really alter that much. So, fast forwarding to, an EVP, the CEO he's been appointed by the biggest shareholder in the firm, and he's the son of the family that has the biggest shareholding. And the guy couldn't run a bath. I mean, he's bright enough in his way, but he couldn't run a bath, and everything was seat of the pants and arbitrary. And he wanted everything in a state of absolute total confusion, because that meant he could hide within that confusion and could avoid accountability and responsibility. So, and it was the same sort of thing. I'd tell someone to do something, then he'd tell them to do something different, and then deny it. He'd make promises and then would deny those promises, and so on. So also in meetings, I'd be sitting there. This is reporting to the board, and he would then come out and say, well, everything was fine until Billy Bob fucked it up. And then he'd look over it and he'd go, what? Fucked up what? And then I didn't know, what are you talking about fucking it? What's going on? So you have to navigate these sort of things. And this guy was just a master at, well, actually he wasn't really good at it, but he had the position where he could avoid responsibility. So the toxic boss thing was related to competence. So bringing it back to that. Now, the warehouse manager guy had simply outlasted everybody else and only had to meet a very low threshold of being minimally literate. When he would write things out, he couldn't spell to save his life, and he couldn't form a sentence. And it was some of his attempts at grammar were laughable. But for that job, in a suburban warehouse, he would stay there until he died. It was going to be a job for life. He probably couldn't get another job. So for that threshold of competence and capability, he probably met that minimal threshold and was only there because, again, he outlasted everybody else. So it was a form of attrition, and he was the oldest guy there, or those sorts of things. So it wasn't directly related to competence. It was more time served and low threshold requirement. Now, when I looked at any manager I worked for that had won their position or gained their position or achieved that level of seniority based on competence and based on accomplishment, achievement, and credentials, qualifications, or when you look at all of that, the ones that had the highest level of capability in terms of, again, credentials, achievement, accomplishment, they were typically the best managers. Not that they were without fault, but they typically were the best. They understand the job, they knew what needed to be done, and they prepared to accept responsibility and accept their mistakes, and they would back up their promises. So if they said, I'm going to give you a 10% pay rise, this pay review time, you knew you were going to get it. Whereas some of the others said it, you would be, it was maybe you'll get it. The chances are in a few days' time you talk to the person. Now, some of this is incompetence, people doing overreach, a bit of self-aggrandizement. They want to show you power. Yeah, Billy Bob, I can do this, I can do that. I can wave a magic wand. And then they go to their boss, and their boss says, no, you don't have that sort of discretion. So somehow they have to back out of it. And save face, so they'll try and deny it or something like that, when in reality they've overreached in the first place, and they shouldn't have done that. And the overreaching, which is, I think, it caused a lot of this U-turns and so on. The overreaching is part, a sign, an indication of someone who's not qualified in their job. If they need to do that overreaching, which is a form of aggrandizement. So now we have a situation where, and I come across this every day, just in the people I deal with, and in my business, or the business I share and that I deal with, increasingly, if not universally now, I'm dealing with people who are affirmative action, diversity, equity, inclusion appointments. Now that comes in from two directions. One is the minorities and the classic proverbial black lesbian getting over promoted, and on the other side, it's the finance, the Black Rocks and those sort of guys who are appointing their flunky stooges in at the other end. So you get it coming in at both ends there, where these unqualified people are holding these and it's cringeworthy, embarrassing in so many cases that these people have achieved nothing. They've accomplished nothing, built nothing, produced nothing, and yet they're being elevated into positions of seniority. But coming back to this idea of the toxic boss, spreading rumors. If you've got an incompetent toxic boss, they'll be terrified of competence. And I see this again around all the time. The amount of well-qualified straight white male execs that are fired within a few months of having started at a jobs that again in companies that we deal with, and I make a point of sitting down with the CEO and trying to gently and kindly sort of dig out the reasoning, and they go, I just got rid of Billy Bob because I don't know, he just didn't kind of fit in. He was a hard worker, and he was good at his job, and yes, he behaved well. Yes, he arrived on time. I've got no complaints about Billy Bob at all. No, he did a good job, and so no. But he just, I don't know, he just didn't. What it means, Billy Bob didn't fit in with the affirmative action sort of DEI culture that exists and has been, infused into these places. Now, hopefully, we'll start to see that unwinding in the years to come, because it's got a devastating effect on business everywhere. Now, on top of it, if we look at mass migration, as an example, a lot of Western governments have effectively guaranteed jobs to vast numbers of Indians and goodness knows what Chinese, guaranteed them jobs that they could never have earned or acquired on any form of merit. Certainly by my experience, wherever I worked, where merit was not the only but a primary determinant of most managerial jobs, then most of the managers were actually pretty good. Not that they didn't have the failings, that some of them did in some ways, and also managers that are constantly calling meetings. There's endless meetings and there's no agenda, and the meeting meanders, and there's all posturing and politicking and snide little jabs, and that's also a sign of a toxic manager. But the toxicity, the level of toxicity, is in direct relationship to the competence. And if they've earned a position, they'll be a lot less toxic than if they haven't earned it. And those who have not earned it, who are typically going to be very insecure in the role, they know that they're not up to it. And they'll attempt to surround themselves with idiots as well. Another thing I've known about a competent manager, they'll surround themselves with competent people. I'm thinking of one boss now I had where he did surround himself with the competent people, but the people that directly reported to him, the people in his immediate vicinity, he made sure he hired, mentally retarded, simple-minded flunkies, when they were directly in his orbit. And one day we were driving along in his flashy Mercedes, and I can't remember where we were. We were somewhere in Europe as we drove along, and he said, Billy Bob, you know why I hired you? I said, well, no, I don't. What do you mean, why? Are you going to unhire me? I got a big mortgage, hey. So he he said, because, we don't have to deal with, we wouldn't last 5 minutes together if we had to tolerate each other or put up with each other sort of in the same office at the same time. But, you look after all the international stuff, and I hardly ever get to see you. So it's a good relationship. You do a good job. You do what I want you to do. And, but I don't, we don't get in each other's face. He said, if you were if you were going to be in closer proximity, I would never have hired you. You're too much your own man, and this sort of stuff. So I thought, okay. So I thought this is a prudent time to keep quiet and smile. He doesn't. My pay review was coming up. So anyway, that's the wider thing about it. So what DEI and affirmative action has done is create this massive tsunami wave of incompetent, toxic, middle, upper middle, and so on managers, and even at the upper echelons as well. And that's a price that our standard of living, our business sector, our competitiveness, it's a price, and it's a huge price, a brutal price that we're all paying for this insane social experiment, which has produced, created, and built nothing of value for Western society. You've been fantastic today. Your pushback, John. Thank you for listening.